Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. So a week or two ago, I posted a scan from my first roll of slide film that I took on Fuji Velvia 50 in 2005 or 2006. It was a scan from a roll I shot in Bryce Canyon National Park. And I use it as an example to compare film versus digital and see which rendition people liked more. And I got a lot of really interesting responses to that. And I thought that rather than just reply in that thread at length, it might be a good opportunity to have a discussion about it in a video. And to also talk a little bit about my film workflow and how I process this particular image, and also take another look at that image. Because the scan that I posted was from 5 years ago, and my techniques and my sort of mentality about how to shoot film has changed a lot since then. Recently I've gotten into watching Family Matters in HD on Hulu, and what I found really interesting is that this show that was shot on film 30 years ago looks like it was shot today, because you take the same film with new techniques and new technology and you scan it again and you get just this beautiful image quality. One thing I also noticed is that I'm only like 4 years younger than Carl Winslow was when that show started. So having a little bit of a crisis about that, but let's move on. So basically, I took that shot back into 2015, 2016, and I wanted to take another look at it, scan it again, take you guys along the journey, and see where we go from there. So there's an interesting story behind this shot, actually. It was at Bryce Canyon National Park. I'm there with my now wife, then girlfriend, and I was shooting my Nikon F3. Love this camera. It is my very favorite camera. And I had my first roll of Fuji Velvia film on there. And along the hike, the sun is getting low in the sky, and we come across this beautiful scene where the low sun is hitting this sandstone wall and casting this beautiful like orange glow on this singular pine tree. And I was really taken back by it, and I quickly took out, I was carrying two cameras at the time, my digital, which was an Olympus camera, the Micro Four Thirds digital camera, and my Nikon F3 with my film. And I took the digital shot just to make sure I got that, because I was still very, very new with film and not really sure if I was going to get it right. And then I propped up my tripod and I took out my Nikon F3 and I set the exposure just so, and got the depth of field that I wanted, and was ready to take the shot, and I pulled the shutter and nothing happened. So what happened? So this camera is a film camera, but it does take batteries. The batteries are not... The batteries are there because it has an electronically controlled shutter, as well as they control the light meter that's inside the camera. So it doesn't take pictures without a battery. And I had the same batteries in there for months and months and months, and didn't think a second about it, but it decided to fail at that moment. The good thing is that it does have one shutter speed that works on manual, 1/160th of a second. And if you pull this little lever right here, you can take a shot at that one shutter speed and hope everything works out. So I did that. And it turned out, kind of surprisingly, through some sort of magic. Slide film is historically very difficult to expose properly. I was bracketing exposures a lot, taking a darker exposure and a brighter exposure just to make sure that the highlights weren't blown out or the shadows weren't blocked up. But I didn't really have a choice this particular time. So I made sure, I guessed at the exposure and shot at 1/160th of a second. It turned out okay. So now what I want to do is take a look at that positive, and we're going to scan it using SilverFast, application that I use, and do a little bit of processing on it, a little bit of sharpening, and you can see the finished product now versus the scan that I did in 2016. And we can compare those two, and I'll also show you the digital shot so you guys can see a clear representation of the same shot with a similar focal length at the same time, and you can tell me what you think. All right, so here we go. First, let's take a look at the slide on my makeshift iPad light table. And as you can see, the slide has captured a pretty good dynamic range in the shadows and the highlights. The sky looks good, it's not blown out. The shadow areas around the tree are still visible. So this is a good starting point. All right, here we are in SilverFast SE 8.8. This is the software that came with my scanner. You can choose to use Epson Scan if you like, or any other sort of tool to capture the image from the scanner. I like SilverFast because it allows a great deal of flexibility, a lot of great options, and you can get a pretty good result right out of the application before round tripping into Photoshop. So this is the application as you would open it. I've already done a pre-scan, you see in this main window here. That basically just takes a scan of the entire scanner glass. If you had multiple strips of negatives here or positives, they would show up, or whatever you're scanning. I want to isolate one particular frame. So in this lower part of the image here, this is the image, the photo that I want to capture. So I'm going to resize this bounding box here and just give a sort of a rough estimate of the frame of the image. Okay. From there, I'm going to zoom in by clicking this magnifying glass in the upper left-hand corner. All right, it's done another more detailed scan of this particular frame so that I can get a little bit more detail. I can become a little more granular in how I edit this. So I'm going to drag these bounding boxes in a little more. I'm going to do a final crop in Photoshop, but I just want to get a rough idea of the frame of this negative or of this positive. All right, so before I mess with anything here, one of the things you might notice is it does look a little too sharp. There are a lot of like haloing artifacts around these edges. That's because it does an automatic unsharp masking, which is a sharpening filter. I'm going to turn this off entirely because I'm going to do all of my sharpening in Photoshop or Lightroom. It is vital, however, that you do sharpen every single scan that you make because it is going to help bring out a lot of detail. But we're going to have a lot more flexibility in doing that in Photoshop. The other thing I notice is it's a little dark. This is a positive. This is slide film. In SilverFast, you don't really have the ability to change the exposure of slide film or how much light or how long you spend on a particular part of the frame. But if you had a negative, you could actually adjust the exposure and actually give it more light or expose the frame for longer so that you can get a little more detail in the shadow and highlight areas. But with the negative, you just have kind of or with a positive, you just have what it's giving you here. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to the histogram by clicking this button in the top toolbar. And I'm going to grab the highlight region and drag it in toward the left a little bit. Now, if I go too far, you'll see that the highlights get blown out in the sky there, but I'm not going to go that far. I'm just going to come right to where the lightest values in the image here end. I'm not going to mess with the shadow values because they look pretty good here. However, I am going to adjust the midtones. That's kind of the sort of the gray area between lightest and the darkest tones of the image. And I'm going to bring that up a little bit. You can see how some of that detail comes right back in. Okay, especially here in the shadowed region. So the next thing that I would do, depending on the type of image it is, or if I wasn't happy with the coloring, I would go to global color correction, and you can adjust the white point of the image here, and you can mess around with that if it's too cool, if it's too warm, too cyan, magenta, any of that. But I think this scan actually looks pretty good as it is. The last thing that I do before I scan any color film is I use this ISRD tool. And what this does is it's dust and scratch removal, but it uses the infrared channel of the scan. It does an additional scan after the initial scan. And it can find where there's physical dust or scratches on the film, and it's able to remove them using an algorithm. This works really, really well. Now, depending on the type of image, you may want to go in and clone out the dust and scratches yourself.
But for the most part, I use this if I'm scanning a lot of negatives or a lot of positives in a row. It does a really good job cleaning that up and actually saves me a lot of time. So that's something I leave enabled. The next thing I want to mess with is the resolution. I find that my Epson V800 has a usable resolution for a 35mm negative, which is what this is, or a positive, up to about 3200 DPI, or it refers to it as PPI here. Now, if I go beyond that, I'm not going to get any more usable resolution out of my scanner. It's just sort of a marketing number that they give you. This preset here, I'm not going to mess with this. This actually tells you at 300 PPI or DPI, a scan of this size is going to give me a print of about 11 by 16. But I'm not really going to worry about that right now. I'm just messing with that resolution. So I'm pretty happy with this. I'm going to take this into Photoshop. I'm going to do a final scan, and then I'll meet you in Photoshop. All right, here we are in Photoshop CC. You can use Lightroom or really any other image editing application. The same tools should be available and pretty ubiquitous. The first thing I'm going to do with this raw scan is do a quick crop to get rid of the border from the scan. You can keep it in if you want to look really fancy in your Instagram post, but I'm going to crop it out. All right. Next thing I'm going to do is there are a lot of edits that I do in Lightroom, and Photoshop has this camera raw filter that mimics a lot of those same adjustments. And because I'm used to a Lightroom workflow, I go right for the camera raw filter. I could do a lot of edits in one place. So let's open this up here. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is see if the overall image needs some adjustments. Does it need to be color corrected in any way? Is there a color cast? Is it too warm or cool? In this basic panel on the right hand side, I can adjust that if I'd like. But I'm actually pretty happy with where it is right out of the scan. Next thing I'll do is if we need to adjust the overall exposure of the image, does it need to be brighter or darker? I'm going to make it just a hair brighter. Perfect. The next thing I'm going to do is have a little bit more granularity in my exposure adjustments, and the way I do that is using the curve. Now the curve shows you a histogram of all of the darkest to lightest values in your image. I'm going to create a point in the shadow region here, and that's going to prevent those dark areas from becoming brightened when I brighten the lighter areas. So I'm going to select another point in the upper middle range here, and I'm just going to drag that up a little bit. It's going to give you sort of a traditional S-curve for increased contrast in an image. Maybe I'll bring the lower parts up just a hair more. All right. And you just kind of mess with this to your taste. You don't want to go overboard because it looks truly awful, like a Michael Bay film or something. Not to say there's anything wrong with that. Perfect. I think right about there is good to me. We'll look at that before and after some basic adjustments. Now what happened here is that by adjusting the brightest tones in the image, the sky got blown out a little more than I would like. So I'm going to use this graduated filter in the upper right hand corner to bring that brightness down just a little bit. All right. Now what I've done here, here's the default for this tool. I brought down the highlights just a little bit, just to bring back some of that color and some of the detail in the clouds in that part of the image, just to bring it all within the same dynamic range. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. The final thing I'm going to do is do a sharpening. Now, there's two types of sharpening. There's display sharpening and there's print sharpening. Today we're just going to look at display sharpening. This is just the basic sharpening that all film scans off of a flatbed scanner need to get back some of the detail that's lost in the scan. So I'm going to go to the detail panel here, and let's zoom in to 100% so we can see what we're working with. Now I am going to go to town on sharpening for a little bit there. Because this is Fuji Velvia 50. It is a very slow film. It is a very sharp film and very low grain. So you can really be quite prodigious with your sharpening with this type of film. If you're using ISO 400 or higher film, you're going to introduce a little bit of noise, so you kind of have to balance detail with noise as you do that, or grain rather. But I'm going to go a little crazy with that. Radius, what this adjusts is how thick the sharpening effect essentially appears. I'm holding down Alt now so I can see just what that adjustment is doing. You see if I go too far, you get a lot of really thick halos around things. But I'm just going to go down to around 1.1 or 1.2. Perfect. All right, so this looks pretty good to me. Let's look at a before and after sharpening. Before sharpening. After sharpening. All right, and we're going to zoom out here to get the whole image. Now, I'm pretty happy with this. We've brought back a lot of the beautiful orange glow on this sandstone. You can't see to the left here, but there's a very bright sandstone cliff that's reflecting the sunlight onto that wall. It's just got this amazing glow. The tree itself is catching some of the direct sunlight, which is lovely. And I love how the soil underneath has these guiding lines that lead you to the tree. So I'm quite happy with this, and it was kind of a nice happy accident. So let's look at one more look before and after. Before and after. Didn't go too crazy, just brought up the exposure a little bit, adjusted the contrast, and I'm going to hit OK. Perfect. All right, here we are in Lightroom Classic. We're going to process the digital version of this image. The adjustments that I'm going to make here in Lightroom are going to be similar to what I did in Photoshop in the Camera Raw filter. So here's the image directly out of the camera. This is the RAW file. As with all RAW files, it's really important to do post-processing on it. Raw images out of a digital camera need post-processing. So the first thing I'm going to do, as I do with all images, is I'm going to start with a different camera profile here in the upper right-hand corner here. And this gives me a good baseline as to how Lightroom is interpreting the RAW file. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I kind of like the way they have some of these camera matching profiles, which are similar to what your camera would do to an in-camera JPEG. For this particular image, I'm going to select Vivid because I like the contrast that it gives me. All right. From there, there's a few other things I'd like to change. I'd like to bring down the overall exposure a little bit because it's a little overexposed for my taste. And there's a couple different ways to do that. I like to click on the center area of the histogram here in the upper right-hand corner and drag that down just a little bit, just to bring it closer to what I saw that day. The next adjustment I'm going to make is a white balance adjustment. I'm going to adjust the temperature of the image, whether it's a little bit too warm in this situation. So I'm going to drag this white balance slider, this temperature slider, to the left a little bit. And that brings out some more of the blues that were in the shaded regions up here, and a little bit of the blue sky. Next thing I'm going to do is adjust the contrast of the image. And I'm going to do, just like I did in Photoshop, I'm going to use this tone curve, okay? So I'm going to do sort of a standard S-shaped curve. I'm going to drag down the shadow regions just a hair, okay? And then I'm going to select a region in the upper region here and bring that up to bring up some of the lighter midtones in the image. All right, and that starts to bring back some of the life in the image. Next thing I'm going to do is bring that sky back down. As I've kind of adjusted the exposure, adjusted the contrast, the sky is a little brighter than it was on that day. So just like I did with the film image, I'm going to use a graduated filter right here in the upper right hand corner, and I'm just going to drag it down from the top of the image. All right, and we're going to adjust what that filter does using this panel on the right. I'm not going to adjust the exposure. I'm actually just going to bring down the highlights in the upper part of the image just a little bit to bring back some of that blue coloring in the sky and bring the exposure back to what I saw that day. All right. And as you can see, it already brings out a lot of the vibrancy in this image. I'm going to close that. Next thing I'm going to do is just bump up the saturation just a little bit. All right. So I'm pretty close to being done here. I think I'd like to increase the upper midtones just a little bit more. Drag this up just a hair. All right, and I think the shadows are a little bit too dark, so I'm just going to bring up this part just a hair as well. Okay. Last thing I do to a lot of my images is apply just a basic vignette to darken the edges and kind of draw your eye toward the center of the image. So in the effects panel here, I'm going to bring down the amount slider just a little bit. Perfect. Now this image was taken on an APS-C sensor, crop sensor digital camera. It was my Nikon D70-100 at the time. And I had a wide angle lens on there, a Tokina lens. But this is pretty comparable to what I was using on film as well. Shooting at about 22 millimeters at f8. So this is pretty close to finished for my taste. So let's take a close look at the image by itself. And let's look at it before the adjustments, kind of straight out of camera. And then once we did a few adjustments there. Perfect. Let's take a final look at the film versus digital renditions of this scene. It's interesting to note how similar indeed they are, and that's no mistake. After seeing the slide, I actually ended up processing the digital to match that look because I liked it so much. Resolution notwithstanding, they're actually pretty similar.
All right, so there you have it. Which one did you like better? Let me know in the comments, and please don't forget to like this video if you liked it. If you didn't like it, I wish you well in your future endeavors, but that's fine too. Also, if you'd like to see some of my work as I release it, check out my Instagram at Matthew Arrington Photo, or you can check out my website at matthewarrington.com. That is my gallery and my prints and all that good stuff. All right. Thanks so much for watching.